Well, hello and welcome to the Mariner's Library with me, Chris Stanmore Major. Now, we're starting a new book today. It's called The Southseaman. It's by Weston Martyr. And I thought we'd get into this as we've had Weston Martyr's name come across our bows a few times in the Mariner's Library. He was the one that wrote that excellent introduction to Captain Voss's venturesome voyages, but he's often mentioned by other sailors of that time as being an inspiration to them and a comrade in what was then a very new area of sporting pursuit, i.e. to sail a small boat purely for pleasure rather than for commerce. Let's read a little bit about him here. Wikipedia has a couple of hundred words about him. It says Joseph Weston Martyr, 1885 to 1966, was a pioneer British ocean yachtsman, writer and broadcaster who was influential in the creation of the Fastnet race after participating in similar races in Bermuda in 1924. Martyr's varied adult life started when he went to sea at the age of 15 to serve on square riggers and then steamers. He then worked as a miner in South Africa, a labour recruiter in China for Rand Mines, and in the merchant and steamship business in Japan. He also spent time trading in the South Seas and banking in Formosa, now Taiwan, and also acted as consul in Shimonoseki. After serving with the Royal Engineers during the First World War in France, he returned to the Pacific and then ran a steamship business in New York. In 1922, he finished his wandering and turned to writing. His first book, The Southseaman, 1926, describes the design and building of a yacht in the fishing port of Shelburne, Nova Scotia, Sheldon in the text. The latter chapters chronicle a voyage to Bermuda and the eventual employment of the vessel in the rum-running trade. The book became a classic of the voyaging genre and was republished and reprinted several times. Many of his stories were published in Blackwood's magazine and heard on BBC Radio. The £200 Millionaire, 1931, explains how to live cheaply on a yacht, and a follow-up essay, £500 Millionaires, 1957, describes how to do the same on canals and inland waterways. Weston Martyr was also a keen archer, writing about his hobby for Blackwood's and other publications. His wife Nora shared the hobby and in 1938 became the world champion. So Weston Martyr was quite the chap. He was involved in all sorts of aspects of being on the water. He wrote the books The Southseaman, one here, Not Without Heat and Dust, The £200 Millionaire, A General Cargo, Paradise Enow, The Pipe Pushers and Other Stories, and The Wandering Years. So I think we've got a few that we can get into later on. But for now, let's start with his earliest work. And this is the same chap, as we say, who sat at Voss's feet and learnt from him, and so was first to step forward and write the introduction for the second edition of Voss's book, wherein he states very clearly that things he learnt from Voss saved his life and the boats that he was on many times. So we've got a little kind of tree of knowledge here that we can start to look back through. Voss gives knowledge to Weston Martyr. Weston Martyr writes it up. That gets picked up by other major writers and readers in the mid-20th century, and that's how these words start to get passed down to us today. But let's get right back to the original source, The Southseaman, another book which features Nova Scotia. I'm honestly not doing this deliberately, it's just Nova Scotia was in the last century and centuries before the centre of sailing in North America in many ways, so not a surprise he should have his boat built here. But without any further ado, let's hear quickly from our sponsor and then get on with The Southseaman by Weston Martyr. The Mariner's Library is now sponsored by Edward William Insurance. Go to edwardwilliam.com to find more details, and if you follow the link in the description for this podcast, you can get a 10% discount on your next policy. Now on with the story. Chapter 1. Once upon a time I built a schooner, but vast heaving. This lordly manner of describing that rapturous business will not do at all. No, I must take a new departure. Once upon a time, the fates, intolerant mood, permitted me to set about the shaping of my heart's desire. The fates, of course, have made me pay for it since, and I am paying still. But what does that matter? Buy a ham and see life, says Mr. Pycroft. Build a boat and taste heaven, say I. For once upon a time I built a schooner, and that was a blissful time. Within my mind, there had been slowly taking shape for years and years the perfect ship. Everyone knows her, I expect, that ship. In the minds of every sailor there float pictures of her, each one perfect, each one different. So when I tell you what my ship was like and of how she came true at last, well, I can hear you. Very pretty, you will say, very nice, and I like that ship, but if she were mine, But I will forgive you, for I know I should be just like that too. To be candid and frank, I will confess I never quite believed the time would ever really come when I should find myself building my ship. The iron hand of circumstance for long held me too firmly, and the project of which I dreamed would seem to me at times silly and absurd, forever unobtainable. But down at the bottom of my heart, I think I always hoped a little, and that little spark of hope was a comfort to me. But why enlarge on this? For you, who still can only build your ships in dreams, already understand me. But I can say this to you: courage, my brothers, courage, and hope on, and some day you may gain your heart's desire, for miracles do happen. One happened to me. It seems to be the business of the ruler of my destiny to heap oppressions on me. He likes to watch me squirm, perhaps, or else maybe he thinks these impositions good for me. Happily, though, he sometimes has his little joke. I fancy he said to himself not many years ago, "Now this fellow of mine is naturally bone idle. He loves the sun and the open air and the sea. He thinks he likes beauty and quietness and peace. Also he abhors commerce and all its works, and he dreams continually about a certain ship. Good. I shall now set him to work in a small, dark, underground room, where he will breathe steam-heated air and toil at figures. As he travels from his miserable den each day and returns to it each night, he shall be penned in underground with alien multitudes. Thus he will have no more time to dream, and he will never see the sea or feel the sun. And then, when his soul is sick within him, I will surprise the beggar." Something like this certainly must have been arranged for me, because there is no power that I know of on earth, including hunger, that could force me miserably to toil for years in a New York broker's office. Yet once I did that very thing. During those horrible years, my vision of the perfect ship grew very, very dim, and sometimes I nearly lost it altogether, but never quite. And then by chance, one lucky day, I met a fellow creature. He was, it turned out, a fellow countryman too, and he worked in a bank some floors above me. I remember that bank well, for when I first went up there to see my new friend, he showed me how, by craning my neck out of his window, it was possible to see the sky. There was very little of it visible, it's true, between those towering blocks of buildings, but the narrow ribbon of blue, with the small round clouds sailing along up there, looked very cheerful to me, and I envied George his view. George, it transpired, had been born and bred at Falmouth, so we two had not been friends for long before we began to talk about boats. He, lucky man, had owned in his youth a little yawl, and had sailed about in her alone, exploring on his voyages most of those little harbours that lie on the shores of the West Country. "Those," said George, "were the days, but since then I've never sailed a boat again, and when I think about it, I know I've been wasting my life." And when I heard this, my heart leapt, for I knew that in that unfriendly land at last I had found a kindred spirit. And after that, of course, whenever we met, our talk invariably turned towards the subject which both of us loved. We talked of boats and the sea, so much indeed that the sea fever latent within us broke strongly out again, until at last we felt we should have to get ourselves afloat somehow or other, or perish. Our first idea was to buy a little boat, in which the two of us could sleep and spend our weekends cruising on the Sound. But we very soon found it was difficult to carry through an enterprise as modest even as this one. A yacht moored below London Bridge in the traffic-troubled waters of the Pool would stand less chance of being sunk or damaged than one berthed in the restless rivers which surround New York. The New York yachtsman has to keep his craft in some safe haven on Long Island Sound, and the journey to such a place would occupy more time than either George or I could spare. But this obstacle we would no doubt have circumvented had we been able to find a boat. Incredible as it may seem, a craft such as we required was not to be bought. Pilgrimages to City Island, that Southampton of New York, were made in vain, and inquiries addressed to yacht brokers brought always the same replies. The gist of them was that very few yachts had been built since the war, that there was now a boom in yachting, and that consequently everyone was a buyer and no one a seller. One or two ancient and most unsuitable craft were offered to us, but prices that almost took away our breath were asked for them, prices assuredly higher than those paid for the vessels when new. When at last it was clear to us that our attempts to buy a boat were futile, such was the strength of the fever stirring in us that we made up our minds to build. But here again we were checkmated, for builders, deluged with large and fancy orders, refused to trouble themselves with such a small affair as ours, and the one firm that condescended to send us an estimate must have figured, we still think, on supplying the boat with a golden keel. Thus, smothered by too heavy a load of adverse circumstances, did our project die, and one night George and I decided to bury the thought of our little boat forever. We were very sad about it, I remember, and then I fancy the ruler of my destiny must have decided, as things could not possibly be made any blacker, that the time was therefore ripe to bring off his little joke. At any rate, that night, as George and I were grieving over the grave of our dead hopes, I was suddenly struck by a brilliant idea, which is a most unheard of thing to happen to me. Great ideas are generally very simple, and my idea was certainly simplicity itself, and this is the manner in which it was unfolded. "George," said I, "how much money have you got?" "About $10, I think," said George, beginning to feel in his pockets. No, I mean in all the world," I said. George is one of those solid, loyal souls who, when a friend asks him for information, will do his best to answer with candour and with care, without bothering himself about reasons. My question probed deep into George's most private and vital affairs, but it did not make him flinch. Instead, he thought a little while, and then said he, "If I sold my bits of shares and things, and cashed in everything I've got, I could raise, I think, about $5,000. "Good," said I. "You're richer than I thought. The savings of my life, with all I can beg, borrow, and steal, would come to about $4,000. Now, George, lend me your ear. As we know, the price of yachts in America is appalling. But there are other countries in the world where a well-built boat can even now be bought fairly cheaply. Suppose we bought one, George, and brought her over here and sold her. I think the profit on the venture would make it fully worth our while." George, as I said before, is a solid soul. The freight and duty would kill the thing," said he. "Yes, dead. Otherwise it's a sound notion." "We could save the freight," said I, "by sailing her over here ourselves, and I'll find out about the duty." "Means chucking our jobs, and you forget the tariff wall they've built around this country. It's high, my boy, and there isn't a loophole in it. I'll inquire about the duty, as I've said, but as for our jobs, are you in love with yours, George?" "It stinks in my nostrils." "Then why worry about throwing it up? If this scheme is as good as I'm beginning to think it is, why, we needn't stop at one. We could build a bigger boat out of the profits on the first, and then, you see, the thing goes on ad infinitum. Lord, what a life, sailing boats across the Atlantic and making our fortunes out of it. Think of it, George." "Yes," said George, unmoved. "I'll think of it, but carefully, and then maybe we'll see." George is 6'3" and weighs nearly a ton, so it is hard to excite him. But when we found there actually was a hole in the tariff wall, and that vessels sailing in on their own bottoms could get through it, duty-free, well, then George began to move, and George in motion was impressive, and he proved himself then to be a man of action, which I decidedly am not. Mine was the idea, but to George is all the credit due for executing it. He wrote concerning that vital point of duty to government officials of whose existence I had never even heard, and what is more, he obtained from those imposing personages written replies confirming the good news about that hole in the wall. Then he wrote to all the boat builders in the world, at least I think he did, for there were very many letters, and in time the answers to them began to reach us. All business correspondence leaves me as a rule extremely cold, but these boat builders' letters were all wonderful, and I read them with delight, for they talked of such things as limber strakes, spirketing, plank shears, hanging knees and whales, not to mention reef pendant cleats and trestle trees. One man even mentioned a martingale, a word I have always loved. I said so to George. Said he, "Yes, but I want you to read that letter carefully. It's from a firm in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, and it seems to me they are the very people we've been looking for. Martingales sound fine, I know, but the point about that letter is it contains an offer to build us a 45-foot schooner for $6,000. And $6,000 is about half the price of a similar boat in New York today. In fact, if you think the construction they propose is satisfactory, well, I'm ready if you are to go ahead and tell them to build." I did not understand, when George said this, that the dream of my life was coming true at last. Things do not somehow happen quite like that, and my realization of the truth was therefore slow. There were many more letters to send to Shelburne, and many more replies to receive concerning details of construction, materials, fittings, and design before the climax came. So a month passed by, and found us still with no definite agreement with the builders, and the contract for our vessel yet unsigned. And then, one day, when we felt ourselves foundering under a mass of ever-growing correspondence, George stood up and spoke his mind. "It's no good, all this writing. We're in for this thing now, so let's do it properly. You'll have to resign and go to Shelburne and settle things on the spot. Tell them exactly what we want, and when they make up their minds what they'll do it for, sign the contract and get them going ahead with the work. You'll be there then all the time while she's building, so that nothing should go wrong. And when you're ready, I'll take a fortnight's holiday and we'll sail her down here and sell her." Thus did we ingeniously plan. I parted, indeed, from my downtown broker with a very great joy in my heart, and I bought a ticket for Shelburne. But from this precise point onwards, a great many things were to happen to us that had not been arranged. For the building of a ship, like the wooing of a girl, is a chancy and uncertain proceeding, and we were to find it so. For instance, I sat in my railway carriage waiting to depart, with an eye open for George, who was coming to say goodbye, and at the very last moment he appeared, laden with large bags, which he threw at me. "What's all this, George?" I said. "Something I've forgotten?" "No," he said, "I couldn't stand any more of it. This is my gear. I'm coming too." George, it transpired, had abandoned banking forever. Well, that's all for today. I hope you're enjoying the story so far. The next instalment will be available in the Mariner's Library shortly. And remember, of course, you've got all the content over on YouTube and the Mariner podcast, and of course Patreon at patreon.com/The Mariner. But for now, wherever you are and whatever you're doing, I hope that you are safe and sound, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next one. Cheers.